Our next session is a panel entitled Network Automation Tools Showdown. I would like to welcome our panelists and moderator to the stage. We have Nick Bogle, Thomas Donnelly, Matt Griswold, Mauricio Rojas, Rick Sherman. Then moderating the panel for today is Kat Gurinsky. Kat is a senior network engineer at a large company and has come to us today from Austin, Texas. She is also the chair of the Datadog Program Committee. Kat, over to you.
Thanks, James.
Is Kat saying in the middle?
All right. So I had this idea for a panel a couple minutes ago when we had another automation talk, and then I asked them to compare it with a different automation tool and how it would be similar or different from that one. And the speaker didn't know, which was fine because it wasn't their specialty. But then I had this idea of, oh, we should do a panel on that where we can all compare, because it's really hard to know what to get started into for automation if you're looking to get into something, but you don't know what will be the best fit for your use case. And so we're going to try and address that today and give you guys a little taste of a handful of the more popular tools out there. So I just want to introduce our panelists with a little more background information on them. So Mao has been working in the IT industry for more than 2 decades, leading the introduction of new technologies for data centers and cloud. Originally from Santiago of Chile, he's currently working as a principal consulting engineer for network automation at Nokia. He's continuously testing the limits of use cases for Kubernetes and network automation tools in the data center and the edge. Mao is also passionate with art, using what is left of his creativity at work into the canvas or digital illustrations. Thomas is a senior manager of network engineering at Stripe with over 16 years of experience in the networking industry. He has a track record of successfully designing and implementing networks that support hyper-growth and scaling, both in data centers and corporate environments. Thomas is known for his focus on simple, pragmatic designs that are easily automated. He has previously worked at Twitter and Cloudflare, and in his free time, Thomas enjoys backpacking, music, and runs a Burning Man restaurant. Matt is a technology entrepreneur who has been automating deployments since the 20th century. He is currently focusing his energy on FullCtl, am I saying that right? An open source automation platform. Matt is well known for his expertise in coding and has written code for a variety of applications from trading algorithms to protocol stacks. He is passionate about peering and interconnection and has volunteered for many organizations including EuroIX, Nanog, OAX, and PeeringDB. Rick is an infrastructure and DevOps nerd turned observability advocate at Datadog. Previously focused on network automation at Juniper Networks with PyEZ, Ansible, and Salt, and Puppet on iOS, Nexus, EOS, and Agentless. He is passionate about making the technology journey for everyone a little easier. And then Nick manages the network automation team at Ziply Fiber, focused on automating a legacy ILEC network, including everything from their access network to their optical backbone to reduce overhead, improve reliability, and increase efficiency. In Nick's free time, he also founded and operates the Spokane Internet Exchange and runs a small data center and hosting company. In his 8 years in the industry, Nick has worked in enterprise, educational networks, data center, and WISPs. He is always looking for a problem to be automated. It doesn't matter if it's an obscure vendor, backbone, access, data center, enterprise, or Linux servers. Anything that you do more than once should be automated. All right, so on that note, I'm going to take a seat, and we're going to start with our first topic. All right, so, gentlemen, can you please tell the audience some starting points on when they should consider to start automating? At what point did you all start automating?
I think when you get annoyed by something. I think a lot of it's just like if you're doing something repeatedly or there's like a high chance for error, it's definitely a good task to start with. I think quite often like do a full config generation is a little bit too much for people to bite off or something. And I think you mentioned in your talk as well. Kind of just start with something that's like preset, very easy to gather data on, and then you do something else with it. And then also like automation doesn't have to connect to the devices. You can use Jinja 2 or something like that and do just a template output and then do it and put it in yourself manually. It's kind of a good first step for that.
Yeah, I think that really anything that you do repeatedly, a lot of the things with network automation these days, especially repeated tasks, things like changing host names, interface descriptions, SNMP communities, all of that is, everyone's had to do them, and with any scale, if you do it more than a couple of times, it makes sense to do some sort of automation, and there's all sorts of options and what you can use for it.
Over here he is. Would you like to add?
I think you automate immediately, if for no other reason than for a changelog. But I would always have preached that start automating when you start configuring.
No.
Well, I think you have to start it yesterday, automating, because always you have a lot of operation tasks between, for example, between the IT people and the network people. When you have the tickets, all the meetings to try to figure out the things, sometimes it's too late when you need to start connecting the stuff. Then maybe trying to automate that sort of processes, that would be great.
Yeah, I think to kind of follow on with that, I think you really have to define automation for you as a concept, right? Because there's lots of different ways to view automation. There's lots of different workflows. I think understanding the primitives of what it means to automate or develop these type of processes is a really, really good starting point. And in my opinion, it's kind of table stakes, regardless of what your workloads are. Even if you're just writing a macro in an Excel sheet, like you have to be doing something at this point. And so, start wherever you're most comfortable and get going.
Thanks. Slides for you guys. All right, so we're going to start next by actually looking at some of these different tools and comparing and contrasting them. So first up, this Ansible.
All right.
Clicker for you.
I actually haven't read this in quite a while. I think probably everybody's heard of Ansible. It's been widely used across the board. So as automation tools and platforms go, it's probably good to be familiar with it. And I would go so far as to say it's probably hard to work in this day and age without touching it at some point. It's just a very simple, uses YAML files by default. Lots of times it'll be stored in Git for your changelog and change controls. It's all written in Python, meaning that it uses Jinja 2 for templating, and meaning that you can use Python to have plugins for it and extend it. So it's very simple for those of you who know Python, which is pretty common, I guess. It's completely agentless, which is nice, so then you don't need to have anything installed on the things that you're configuring. It originally was started for doing server configuration, and there's been a lot of network stuff with it as well, and free and open source. It's pretty much mostly imperative instead of declarative, which probably is less hot in this day and age, but it does work and it does do the job that you set forth with that. See if there's anything else here. So the pros is, like I said, it's very easy to learn. It's across the board. People have used it for almost everything, so you can search for things and find lots of different use cases for it. And it's just pretty simple to start with. The list of cons is probably just, like, I personally find it's kind of bang your head against the wall a few times, where it's like, yeah, I'd rather just write some Python to accomplish what you need to do, because it's not maybe the best end all be all for everything. I think the network support is a bit lacking in it. I don't know if anybody else up here has used it for much networking, and I tend to steer away from networking when it comes to Ansible. But it's still around, and I think it still will be around for quite a while. And I think that's it. Were we doing questions at the end, or?
Yeah, we'll go run through all these first.
All right.
Thank you. Okay. Well, I started with Ansible, and then I moved to Kubernetes, basically because we were working with CNF applications at the edge, and also in some data centers with 5G and Cloud RAN. But also we were putting another network functions on top of Kubernetes. And then we realized that we needed a closed loop orchestration, because the big difference that you have with Kubernetes and other solutions like OpenStack is the workloads are moving around pretty fast. Then if you don't adjust your network, you're gonna have some trouble because it's hard to just go in and wait for the tickets to be responded in order to start moving the interfaces. Some people is using spreadsheets, but also it's very hard to keep track of the changes with that. It's not an easy job. Then I started working with closed loop orchestration. But later we are starting to see that there are other projects like Nephew that is actually, you have companies like Google, different other service providers and also vendors that are trying to create something to an orchestration of different levels. Then probably you're going to have a Kubernetes cluster in every site in order to start setting up everything on the network. But also you can have like a top level cluster or meta controller that is going to start doing changes. Then also we started to test, for example, importing the YAML model of the switches and the routers and do active reconciliation. And then we realized actually Kubernetes is giving almost everything. You only need to deploy a small controller. There are many open source projects like GNMIC. You can use those directly on Kubernetes and start doing active reconciliation of the state of the network. Then other things that Kubernetes is giving that we like that because you have multi-tenancy. Then if you have many teams doing different projects of automation, you can split that in different namespaces, service accounts. You have also the granular security for the projects. Is declarative. This is a big difference with Ansible. You can use it for day one or for day two. I just told something about Yang as an example. Also, because you have the CRDs, you can have the life cycle of the configurations that you are doing directly on the network, on the Kubernetes, and it's easier to keep track of any change of the network. Using Manifest or Helm, you can have a machine manipulable configuration that is going to help you to do changes, for example, machine to machine. Using the Kubernetes APIs, they give you a lot of tools. It's a rich ecosystem that you have there. Then if you can start using that to start automating also everything from the single source of truth, that it could be in a Git repository. You can reuse the intent through Helm. I know the Helm is maybe not too popular right now, but you can, for example, Helm, you can use templates as a sort of data sets or blueprints. You can make that from the blueprints and use a value file for all the changes that you need to do with the intent. And then you can export that to other customers or other teams and start reusing the same intent. That is also an advantage. And it's free and it's open source. Actually, you can pay someone to give you support, but you can just download it and start using it right away. Whoops. Okay. And then the pros is, well, you are having just one platform for all the automation, or it's going to force you to be more organized on the automation for your company. Then everything is going to stay in some place. Then also is resilient. Is a solution that actually you can have the 3 controllers, many work nodes, and it's very scalable. It's very easy to scale. And then you have the granular security, multi-tenancy is intent-based from the beginning. You can provide active reconciliation. You have the support of CRDs, custom resource definitions, to create your own schemas. You can deploy your own controller based on open source like a GNMIC. Strong extensibility, is to have a rich ecosystem of applications. So you can use, for example, Argo CD to start pulling the information from your single source of truth, that it could be in a Git repository directly to Kubernetes. The cons, well, is quite more complex than Ansible. You need to understand a little more than just YAML syntax and how to start working with the modules and the roles. It's a little harder to support because it's a more complex system. But you had a lot of online help where you can work with different communities to get all the help that you can need. It's a new concept. Then we don't have strong references. There are some things happening right now, for example, in 5G Cloud RAM that actually they've been there for years. They're doing closed loop orchestration. But the concept of intents, for example, I'm working right now in a project doing segment routing for the transport and using in every end Kubernetes to start setting up everything from the ingress router and the egress router. This is something, for example, very new yet. It requires independent compute resources, maybe 3 bare metal servers to start. And in the case of Ansible, you can do this directly even from your laptop. Then you're not forced to have that. Custom controllers, well, you can deploy or develop your own controllers using projects like GNMIC or the Meta controller from the one from Google, but or that those can be sourced by someone else. In active reconciliation, well, you're putting the state of your network directly on Kubernetes and CRDs, and then you can use the controller to start doing the changes, and you can have GNMI, for example, to do that, and you can import the YAML model, put it directly on Kubernetes, and then start doing changes based on that state.
Awesome, cool. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Puppet, which has been around for an exceptionally long time by computer standards. This came out of the systems administration world. It was one of the first kind of DevOps tools, DevOps culture things that came out of that particular domain. The interesting thing about Puppet is that it is declarative, desired state. You might have heard some of the other portions already. And the interesting thing here is that you're really saying what you want configured and not necessarily how that's configured as it relates to dependencies and interrelationships and things like that. But it did and does require a domain-specific language, so you actually declare that desired state using the Puppet DSL, domain-specific language. But it has a ton of prepared content for you. Predominantly in the systems administration side, there is some networking and some cloud pieces in there that I'll discuss here shortly. It is open source under the hood. You could extend it to whatever nefarious means you could come up with using Ruby, which is not as popular amongst this crew here, but Puppet, Chef, which I don't talk about, were both based on Ruby. The interesting thing here is with Puppet 2 is the default source of truth. One of the differentiators between, say, Puppet and Ansible is, Puppet DB, where you actually keep your inventory and your mapping between desired state and different groups of inventory. It's a little bit different than how you might handle something with Ansible, for example, with flat files. One of the major misconceptions, if you will, about Puppet is that it is exclusively agent-based. Historically, it was built on an agent that's going to handle things like identifying the system, what resources are available on it, and then applying that configuration. For things like networking and cloud resources, it is agentless. So that's going to vary in workload depending on what your target is. Again, there's free and open source. There's also an enterprise version. It scales out quite a bit based on the model with the agents. It doesn't scale quite as well without agents for obvious reasons. And so the pros about at least being aware of Puppet is that it is pretty widely used, particularly in the compute space, servers, etc. And understanding what desired state is, declarative versus imperative. So if you were to look at something like Terraform, where you're going to be managing cloud resources, that's very similar, right? It's declarative, they've got their DSL, they're figuring out all the dependencies and resolving them. So understanding the concepts of that are going to help you interact with other folks that might be automating different types of workloads. So I wouldn't necessarily be using Puppet on the network anymore, which is a tough pill to swallow since I led that group there for a couple of years. But the focus just is not quite there. So from my perspective in the networking world, it's important to understand what Puppet is and how to interact with maybe your peers who might be using their source of truth or some of the other things, but it's probably not going to be what you use in the network as it stands today. Doesn't mean you can't. There are support for iOS, XR, XE, Arista, Juniper, a few other boxes, but it's probably not to the depth that you really would want it to be in comparison to something like Ansible or some of the other options that the other panelists are going to speak to. And then Salt is one that I worked with many moons ago. It is possible that my knowledge here is incorrect or dated, and if so, please be kind in your feedback about it. I will speak to it from my best effort. But I wanted to talk about it because it is also event-driven as well as declarative. And so if you look at some of the other configuration tools of that generation or of this generation, event-driven is becoming more prevalent in terms of how you would go about automating something. You might want to say, if this thing occurred, go ahead and take this action. And you can shoehorn Ansible to do that with webhooks. There's a few other tools out there that may do that, but Salt was kind of a pioneer in that event-driven automation space. Again, they were also based on an agent, eventually added agentless. I believe they called them minions, which was real fun. The folks at SaltStack were really fun to work with. Python based, so you kind of have that overlap with Ansible. And so you kind of had Puppet Chef and then Ansible and SaltStack in those two different kind of communities, a little bit of overlap there. But they actually had a pretty good networking support. They released a few different modules that were native, depending on the different device vendor that you were working with. But they were a bit ahead of the curve where they also added in support for NAPALM and Netmiko, which gave you a lot more flexibility that you could achieve on your networking automation, and maybe use that to up-level some of the more bespoke things you might have already been writing with those tools. And also a shout out to the NetBox module as well. They recognized the need for a source of truth in networking that was specific, and so they wrote some integrations there. Unfortunately, I don't think they ever really saw as much uptake as the rest of the automation tools in that particular class around that time. They were also acquired a while back, and I have no visibility into the future of SaltStack, but as a casual observer, it doesn't feel very strong. But would happily hear anybody from SaltStack or VMware that may have a different opinion or could provide a little bit of clarity on that.
All right, so I'm going to talk about Nornir and Netmico a little bit here. Mostly around Nornir, but I think Netmiko being kind of a related product is definitely worth on touching there as well. So Netmiko itself is actually just a Python library that simplifies connections to various network devices. They support a lot of vendors out there, Arista, Juniper, Cisco, no problem. But it's a very straightforward way to kind of pipe strings or text files directly into network devices and make some quite simple automation right out of the gate. Nornir is like a pure Python framework that's designed to kind of handle very similar. Like the previous ones are kind of more like systems oriented, where Nornir is definitely more network oriented through the whole way through of it. That as being part of that is it's a little easier to work with some of the vendors, supporting NAPALM, supporting kind of PyEasy, the whole way down, and all the other vendors as well. Really, the way I think the best way to think of Nornir is it's kind of like a fancy inventory and thread handler that connects to the devices, does multi-threading for you, and then kind of kicks back all the output that you requested from it. There's no pseudo languages needed, which is nice. You don't have to kind of learn how to write runbooks or anything specific. If you know any amount of Python, it's a super easy way to get started. And if you don't know any Python, maybe a good time to learn a little bit. Nornir is super flexible on inventory. You can write different ways to ask for specific hosts. So I can say I want to do all Juniper core routers, and then I can connect to all those and then run whatever task I've requested from it. There's also a lot of integration and documentation of how to make it work nicely with NetBox, which I think is gaining a lot of popularity very fast. And then, as I mentioned, it works with pretty much any applicable interface that works with Python, including just standard APIs as well, which we do with our Aruba wireless products on that. Speaking of the pros, it's probably the easiest, especially Netmiko, but it's probably the easiest way to get started if you haven't done any automation before. You know how to type some basic tasks. You can put them into Nornir and Netmico, and it puts out the output, and now you have your first automation or simplified scripts. Allows it usage of pretty much any existing library. It has really, really good exception handling, which is one of the reasons we actually had started with Ansible at my current place, and we moved away from it just because as you're running the exceptions, a good example is doing upgrades on some Juniper switches. Sometimes they would work and sometimes they wouldn't. And this is actually right in the actual upgrade guide. Like if you get this, then run it again. And if you don't, do this. And so we were able to write very easy, look for a specific string. If that string comes out, do the upgrade process again. Nornir is multi-threaded right out of the box, which makes it very easy. You can set the number of threads in a simple file with just a single line. And that being said, there's some extremely good, they are paid for, and there are some free ones as well, but some really great training sessions out there to kind of help you get started with some very functional scripts, very quickly. On the cons, there's not a lot of current ecosystem for it yet, so there's not a lot of pre-made tools out there that may do things for you automatically. You'll probably have to end up writing a lot of your own tool sets. Additionally, some programming experience is helpful if you've never done any programming at all. Learning about what the difference between a string or a dictionary is and why the dictionary is in order every time you run it may give you a couple curveballs that you're not expecting. The thread handling requires some learning. I think this applies to pretty much any tool that interacts with Python, but if you're printing some output while another thread prints output, you may get some stuff smashed together. And if you've never dealt with this before, that can be a little unsettling. And then the Nornir documentation, as they've been developing very quickly on it, the documentation can be a little bit behind the current versions, but that has been improving as time has gone as well. But overall, I think Nornir and Netmiko are probably the fastest ways you can, but next week you could have some usable script for automation, and definitely something that a lot of people like to see results quickly on rather than building this huge ecosystem around it.
All right, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about something that you probably haven't heard of. Oh, you already went back. So Netpalm is a tool that has been one of my favorite as of late, and it's really a combination of a lot of tools. So it is a REST abstraction layer to allow you to really scale out your automation runs. So at scale, if you have a lot of things that you really have to touch, or you have things that have to be touched very often, or with different variables, or from a existing system, whether that be like a billing system or a support system, anything like that, you can really easily create functions that are able to interact with those with REST API. So from interacting with the network perspective, it can use netconf, restconf, CLI using Netmiko. It can use SNMP. It really can be anything that you want. If you have the data, you can pull it. You can also write custom Python drivers for it. So if one of those options doesn't work for you for any reason, it's pretty easy to extend that to include additional drivers. And then it also brings in a lot of the data transformation that you have to do to make your functions vendor agnostic. So you can use TTP for template parsing, you can use Jinja, you can use TextFSM, all for parsing CLI output of the device or config output of the device into a uniform structure that can be read from another system. One of the other great benefits of Netpalm is that it's very scalable. So it's built on essentially a worker and queuing architecture. So you've essentially got the REST API on the front end, then you've got worker nodes on the back end that can be scaled out infinitely and put into a queue with Redis, and you can work through that very easily. So one of the main benefits that I see with Netpalm is that it's really a roll-up of everything that you need for a business-ready API. which may not be applicable for just starting out on automation, but as you start scaling it out and you need to work with other systems within your organization or even your own tool sets, being able to have a REST API abstraction layer is very important. So Netpalm pros, I would say that the main pro in my opinion is that it produces an API that can be consumed by anything that can consume a REST API, and you can support and transform the output from like many vendors' devices, no matter how weird or anything that might not have a driver for an existing system. You can easily write, text FSM templates and stuff to parse the output and bring it back into a consistent format for all of your devices. And then it's also the container-based scale-out architecture for every individual component within. You can have multiple front ends. You can have multiple, you can do Redis Sentry with multiple Redis containers. You can do as many workers as you want. You can do pinned and first in, first out queues. And so it really makes it very scalable and good for large environments. So, but on the con side, it does require more setup and development, right? It's not something that really does anything out of the box. There's not really any native or pre-built functions. There's examples of how you can query, using Netpalm or using NAPALM or Netmiko or SNMP, given whatever command you're trying to do. And it's a newer and smaller community than for some of these other tools. But it is built on, other very large tools that are often used independently, like Netmiko. It's really just a roll-up of all of those into a pre-built solution that you can use as a platform for developing out APIs for all of your network automation needs. So that's Netpalm. I think that we're on to questions. So anyone have any questions?
Yeah, so we'll pause here. We have some other topics to cover with our panelists, but we'll do a quick pause for some questions here. If any of you had specific questions around any of the tools that we just covered, I'll let you guys come up and ask those. And then if not, we've got plenty of other questions for the panelists to cover. Looks like we might have a virtual one, Michael.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes, we have 2 questions that come from our online marketplace. If a company is doing good in automation in their company, how would that company take it to the next level? I'm just a reader. I don't make them up.
If the company's doing good, how would they take it to the next level of automation?
Yes.
I could take a stab at that.
Okay.
If you look at automation, there's a maturity curve that has been in place for a long time. The interesting thing for me is coming back to this audience and this type of community is that automation and DevOps has been around now like at least 15 years. And if you go back to like CF Engine, even longer. I think any organization is continuously growing and evolving and adopting either more automation, more observability, more CI/CD. This is a continuum. I don't think you're ever done. But for this group in particular, if you are starting your automation journey or you're really looking to up-level it, I think having the communication and buy-in across teams is really when it becomes that kind of like aha moment where you're actually able to use your automation or the outputs of that to show business value, to show growth, whatever it is that like your company as a whole can really rally around and break down silos of communication, right? So that you're able to communicate your needs and your concerns with other folks that may be dependent on you who don't necessarily use the exact same tool set that you're using. I think for me, that's really up-leveling it to the next level.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, from the top of my mind, there are many stages for automation. Well, basically, you can start with the scripts. That is the most basic automation. Then you can go with the event-driven automation. That means you're getting events, and based on the events, you're answering with something, from the system. That is going to require probably APIs and something a little more fancy. Then you have intent-based automation that is trying to make the things simple for other machines to understand what are you trying to do. And the final stage for me should be autonomous networks, means now you can start using rules and maybe taking patterns from machine learning or using AI and start trying to make the things to think by itself. But those are the things, the stages. That I don't know on what the stages the company is, but I would say they need to see a way like this in order to get better in the automation.
Yeah, I think kind of continuing on both of what you said is like at some point, maybe a hot take, but like start removing network engineers from the job. Maybe not directly the role, but like we have, for a good example, is like our AV team, like they need to have additional leases and rules created for this. Like, great, we'll use retool, we'll build a UI for it. They hit apply, it pushes it out to us. We make sure the change looks good, and you hit apply. And that way, we're not writing additional rules. We're not putting it in a netbox for them. At some point, like we've now abstracted our role to something that somebody else in a different business unit can understand more easily, which is great because like I would rather spend my time thinking about longer term plans and less about pasting things from Excel spreadsheets. And then I think kind of additionally, no one, I wouldn't say no one, but very few people or companies have automation 100% across all devices always. I think knowing your state and actually having some sort of direct output of like what percentage are you in compliance. And then if you're out of compliance, like why are you out of compliance on that one? So one thing that we're kind of looking to implement soon is if you ever make a change on a device without automation, it will open a JIRA ticket against you and say like, why was this change made outside of automation? Do we need to fix the automation tool set, or was this just an emergency one-off, or kind of whatever the next step there is? But I think having some sort of accountability of like why your automation isn't perfect, even though it doesn't have to get there, but knowing why it's not perfect is a good next kind of step to have.
Okay, we have one other question. This is from Michael Brooks. Where are the NOMAR, hopefully I said that right, training sessions available? Or did I misunderstood that he was referencing to free sessions?
Is that the Nornir training sessions?
Yes.
Yeah, so I don't know if name drop, but Kirk Byers does some really great classes for Nornir, and I think he's one of the large contributors on it. Like, highly recommend check it out. He has some free automation classes, which was what I took the first time, and then later did the paid for it after, and like they were definitely worth the investment of my time.
That's it for online
And then we've got
questions.
an in-person behind you. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hey, Dan Kriz with Sierra. I believe it was said a little earlier that Puppet wasn't recommended for network automation, and I'm just wondering what were some of the pitfalls that actually made you come to that conclusion?
So in Puppet, there was a lot of different focus areas. Networking definitely was one of them, and I think we achieved a lot of initial success, but had a lot of headwinds against, quite honestly, the networking community. Folks were not particularly interested in automating network devices at the scale that was useful to us, to be quite candid. And I no longer work there. I don't represent them. This is my own opinion. And so there was a little bit of that. Also, Puppet itself its configuration model is based on a per node basis. And when you look at networking, it takes 2 to tango at minimum. And so having the graph extend across devices never really came to fruition, which I would also say is a deficiency in pretty much all of these other tools, unless you are building it yourself. We still kind of lack that inter-device dependency model in any of these things.
Thank you.
Another question, Michael?
Yeah, I got 2 more online. This is from Ryan Morrill. No matter what tool you use to drive ad hoc, declarative, event-triggered, or other automation, what ancillary tools do you find super helpful? Examples would be Squiz, Netbox, Capria, and NetUtils. Thank you.
I think some sort of network monitoring tool to know when you've automated an outage is usually pretty good. So we use LibreNMS is one that we enjoy. I've used Nagios in the past, which is also quite flexible. And then I have some kind of peers that really enjoy like Zabbix and stuff like that. So knowing what you've done and actually able to see that the change either did or did not have the desired effect is good. And then as mentioned, Netbox is something we use pretty extensively.
To expand on that, I think a logging solution is also very important. Being able to track down why something failed, or if it seemed to have succeeded but didn't, like having some sort of a central logging source that you can look at is very important. And I'll add to Netbox as well. It's a great tool, very extensible, and makes it a great place to store source of truth. We use it very extensively.
Anything else? We'll do the person question back there.
Hey, thanks. Austin Carter, Unity Fiber. From a point of culture, how have you guys addressed the culture change to automation? And let me put some context. I heard this conversation last week. Hey, we want to automate some things. Well, I don't want, from a VP, I don't want our engineers to not know how to do this in a CLI, so I don't want to automate it, right? What have you seen in your companies, and how have you addressed that and move? Because we've got to move forward, right? How do you progress out of that old mindset?
So to be able to automate anything, you kind of have to know how to do it to begin with. So, if it depends on how your org is structured, if your automation sits separately from your network engineering groups, right? But it's really a collaboration. You have to know both engineering and development to be able to do, good automation. Somebody always has to know how to do it, otherwise you can't automate it.
And scale is like so important, right? Like you have engineers that know how to do things, but when you get to a certain scale in your network, you can't have enough people at a certain point, right? So you've got to do something to offload that from your headcount.
I would say that sometimes I'm seeing the problem that from Kubernetes, for example, from the point of view of Kubernetes, you have some elements that can work as part of the network. We tried to do something before creating some CNI plugins, very advanced, that can do some stuff like routing policies and that stuff. Network operators didn't like it at all. And then we have to reboot all the strategy and see how we can keep the Kubernetes APIs doing stuff, but try to keep all the information inside the network. Then that way the network operators feel that they still have control, they can still do an assurance over that same information. Then I would say you need to respect the boundaries of the operation teams before to think about how I can automate or how can I make those teams, for example, work together.
Well, and I want to expand upon it because I think it's a good topic kind of to discuss a little bit. I don't leave stand there all day. But that actually is thematic that individually, one person, one small team will find success automating something. They will take the initiative, they'll get there, they'll just kind of make it happen. The problem becomes culture, right? And so, and this is, it was either one of the data DevOps or the DORA report. I think somebody had a mention about that in their session yesterday. I saw something about that in the Network to Code Slack recently. Being able to explain the value that you extract from automation, not from a technology standpoint, but from either a business standpoint or communication standpoint, is the problem that I think a lot of folks are experiencing. And there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to that, but you're going to have to probably put on a different hat. If you are taking the initiative and advocating for automation or trying to prove that you did a thing, you're probably going to have to build allies. You're going to have to understand what people's resistance is to automation. Is it technological? Is it cultural? Is it financial? And you're going to have to try to work around that. And it's still ongoing.
I think kind of adding on it is documentation, right? If you have a script that say turns interfaces on and off, if I have 5 different network vendors, I may not know the command instinctively how to turn the interface off. So if you really want to make sure people still know how to run the commands, just show your script and then show like on Arista do this, on Cisco do this, on whatever, what the equivalent is. And then if somebody's, heat of the moment, we have an outage, like go to your wiki, like great, that's how I do it. And you hop in and you can still do it. So
That makes sense. Thank you.
One last question online for now. Which, if any, automation tools have the panel found to be successful with Nokia SROS?
Okay.
I just read them.
It's a hard question because you have many tools. Right now, some people are using NSP because they are more comfortable with the graphical user interface solution, that it can do discovery and do the CTP, for example, and that kind of stuff. Other companies prefers to use Ansible with SROS. Actually, you can use Ansible with SROS also. And now we have the model-driven solution. Then now you can use a GNMI. Then I would say successful has a reference. I'm seeing more on the NSP because network operators still are accustomed to work with the graphical user interfaces. But if you want to go on the automation point of view and go through that path, probably you need to start doing things with Python, Ansible, or even more advanced with the GNMI and Kubernetes and things like that.
I'd seen someone earlier, I think it was Jared, was up for a question. Could he step back down? Come on, Jared. You still want to ask your question?
Hi, Kat. Jared Mach, Akamai. I sat down a little bit because the panel partially spoke to the issue that was raised as well. I think just around the corporate culture and around the culture of the engineering, not only the engineering but the management and the support stuff. And I guess I'll ask kind of a follow-up question because I was kind of going to respond to the last questioner in that and just say, the culture is really one of the things I've seen is the biggest driver in that. How have the folks here on the panel dealt with when the goal of the driving the automation and the corporate culture, especially when it comes to people who maybe are less familiar with routers and networking as like the primary thing they do in their business? How have you dealt with teaching people about why it's important to invest into this and driving that cultural change that's needed? Because if you have lots of servers, I think people understand like, oh yeah, you can't do that at scale. But when it comes to the routers, people tend to think that it's more possible. And there's a lot of engineers who grew up, I think, learning like, oh, you type conf t or you go into configure and you go do these things. And they enjoy doing those things. Like that's their thing. So how have you built that culture at your organizations? And what are the challenges you've seen in building that culture towards being automation first? Because I think for me, that's one of the big challenges is getting people to think about that automation and having some sort of a back end for that's representative of the network first, which I think is really, I think it's a big gap.
Yeah, I've been in both sides. To be honest, I've been working with the network only the 7-8 years. Before that, I was working as VMware, OpenStack, and the data center. And for me, the network guys were the enemy, to be honest. Because every time that we were turning on a virtual server, you can do it in 2 minutes. It took us like 2 weeks to have it connected. That was crazy because we have to go with tickets, meetings, explain what we want to do. It was even worse when we tried to interconnect different data centers with the different cloud systems. Then the way that actually we tried to make that work, and actually worked, was the network operation team gave us 2 people that they were very open-minded to start working with our DevOps team and creating the tool with our DevOps team. And maybe in 6 months, we're starting to see a lot of automation on the network activities. That was our formula that time, but it was a really, really hard transition for us to go that way. But that works really, really good.
I'm going to also jump in too here. I think too, for a lot of your network engineers that really like doing their ConfTs and configuring stuff, which I used to love doing, getting them introduced to this aha moment, like for me, like about 6 years ago, I took a class on doing some automation, and just like seeing some of the possibilities that I didn't know I could automate got me on board. And then I went back and had to learn more and figure out what else I could do. And so I think sometimes it's just they don't know that they could do those same things in an easier way, in bulk, and just make their life that much simpler. So it's education too, I think, really, for your culture.
Agreed. I mean, there's still kind of nice when you get your default config out of the box and you got to delete it all. There's some magic to that, definitely. But also, like, most of us here, we like more 9s, right? Like, network wants to be stable, and like, really, the only way you can be truly stable in a large network is to automate it. And so, at some point, being able to say, I have 100% uptime in this last year is like a pretty cool feeling. And like, people that have 1,000 devices are configuring by hand, like probably are not putting that number up.
Yeah.
I think that slowly introducing automation and letting the engineering folks that are not necessarily in agreement with moving towards automation will help. If they obviously know what the benefits of automation is. I think we all do. But until you see it firsthand, the fact that you're getting less on-call calls, the fact that you are able to actually manage your workload and not have to constantly feel backed up with all the things that you have to do, it'll help start to make sense to people and be more open to it. But it's definitely a culture shift for most organizations.
I think a good first jump in on that is firmware upgrades.
Yeah.
First, if you do 100 of these, like, oh man, multi-threaded firmware upgrades, total game changer.
When you were talking earlier too about like just config generation and just having files, right? Originally, which is totally something I did.
Yeah, that's like a lot of people start there.
And like when you can switch to something like Ansible or whatever for your deployments instead, it's like game changing, because something that might have taken you like a week to deploy 100 switches, you might be deploying like 1,000 in a couple days.
Yep.
By automation, it's just
And it's right.
And because now you're not worried about that getting pasted on the wrong box.
Yeah. Oh god. Yeah.
Typoing something.
Or people doing it.
Yeah.
When you have to scale up, you end up adding more people, and people end up doing things differently, and then you don't have any consistency either, or things get done wrong.
And one of the things I wanted to call back to is CAD had some debug scripts about like power, PSU failure, collecting logs for TAC. Automation is more than configuration management, right? So there's other things that you can be automating, like collecting support information or gathering metrics that you might use for your SLOs, SLIs, so that you're using it for your justification of uptime, right? You actually need to be able to empirically say that we were up for this amount of time, or pass an audit, right? Understanding what the configuration was. There's lots of different avenues, and so I think finding the one that matches that business case is really important.
Yeah. I see we've got a question back here.
Hi, Tony Talbert, Comcast. What maybe people on the panel have something to say, or helpful words about kind of the life cycle. I mean, once you've done those, your first few things or whatever, you've gotten started or what have you. What have you seen or what has helped in thinking through, like, okay, well, now how do you like maintain those scripts? Like when some router, particularity changes, with an OS change, okay, now you've got to go in and revisit a bunch of things. Or somebody leaves the company who wrote a certain thing that no one else was particularly familiar with, or they, like every plumber comes in and says, "Oh, the last guy who did this was crazy." I mean, it's the same with code. It seems like people come in and they're like, "Oh, I can read it, but they did it a stupid way," or whatever. How any lessons about that life cycle stuff?
I think documentation is key. Documenting what you do and why you did it, and certain things. I mean, if you can call out while you're developing it, like this is something that might change with a future version, or something that might need to be a variable. Think through that when you're actually developing these. Don't be thinking about today. Think about what it might be like in 2 or 3 years, and think about things that you've seen change and what may change, and try to address those before they become a problem.
Documentation for sure, as he said, that's why all my code is self-documenting and doesn't need comments. So, just kidding. I think also like dedicating time to KTLO, like that's just maintaining these scripts has to be part of your the kind of regular planning, that like some of this stuff is going to break, and we're going to need to spend time on this.
Yep. Coming back to and re-looking over scripts too, that might be really old, because maybe it made sense to write things a certain way 3, 4, 5 years ago. Maybe there's a much better way we could do it now. And so being able to go back and have that regular review of your old scripts so you can continually improve them as well.
The documentation and a Git repository, if you put all the commits with good information, that also is very helpful.
Well, a little bit of a follow-up, like, so things change, somebody introduces a new service that has maybe an unintended consequence on a number of scripts, because you had an assumption that it would only ever happen this way, and now it's 2 or 3 other ways possibly. How do you, if there's anything that you have thought of to handle those, like dependency, sort of figuring out like when when something changes, oh, it's going to have some downstream effects, like documenting that in some sort of glossary. I don't know if there's anything that
I think it always just happens to some extent as well, right? Like you just to kind of have to prepare to deal with that. Like we use a different team's library to connect to our cert proxy to connect to our equipment, and they had made a change on the way that Python module functioned.
Right.
And we were unaware of it, but they were unaware that we were using it. And so kind of like sometimes it just happens. And now they pipe those change requests through us as well. But kind of adding to that, like change requests, right? Before somebody on your team changes something, make sure somebody else on the team approves it, because they may be like, hey, that's going to break my script, and then kind of prevent that cascade a little bit.
And testing environments. I mean, have an environment that you deploy out to and have certain test protocols and test cases that you use regularly that you can find out if something broke before you push it to production.
I would say that also digital sandbox. You can use Container Lab and you support multiple vendors, and then you can create some sort of small footprint of what you're trying to do and use synthetic traffic in order to test that there is connectivity.
And I think beyond documentation, from a culture standpoint, as you start to become more familiar with distributed systems, some of the things that might be happening on the compute side, you build a culture around anticipating those things, right? Like you're always going to run into these cases. How do you deal with this culturally? What's your approach to breaking it down? Do you allocate time to resolve the issue? I think you build that muscle. I think having more of a view into the big picture, how all these things are operating, and being able to communicate with the different stakeholders is also just as important as some of these technology solutions as well.
Yeah. And we're really getting into like software engineering and a lot of this at this point too, right? Like at some point we're starting to leave the realm of networking when you have these problems, and you kind of run into it. And software engineers have been dealing with this for years. So like writing tests, CI/CD pipelines, and that type of stuff, and catching it before it becomes a problem.
Yeah, automated testing for sure. I think is key for that.
If we don't have any more questions for a bit, we will go back to our topic list. So earlier we were talking a lot about Python, but I also wanted to bring up other languages as well, because now I know that we use Go, right, for Kubernetes mostly.
Yeah, well, I'm more a Python person than Go, but I think I have my team, I have people that actually they're very familiar with Go and they prefer Go. I think it's very subjective, the way that you're gonna choose what language actually is better for you. I use Python sometimes also with Kubernetes, but I gotta say that Go is more efficient in memory resources and also in have a lot of libraries for Kubernetes. And I should move to Go if I'm working with Kubernetes. If I'm working with Ansible, Python is the best solution, in my opinion.
Definitely use what people around you use, right? Like don't introduce new language. Like okay, like now we're going to use Perl as well. Like okay, like we don't need to add more knowledge. Plus, like if you get stuck on something, you have a question. Like you have experts around you. If you have a bunch of people using Go, like hey, how do I do this? And somebody's probably going to know.
And it doesn't even matter if they're a network person at that point. If you're just trying to do a basic programming function.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that you also have a community around certain languages that you don't with others, and support and people that you can reach out to. Also in hiring, right? You have to make sure that if it's a new language or something that might not be super familiar out there, it's going to be a lot harder to hire people that are going to be able to help and support and continue to maintain and develop for it. So until it's choosing more mainstream languages tends to be more scalable over time.
Well, and focusing on the primitives of software development is going to allow you to be a polyglot, right? Just because you intimately understand Python doesn't mean you wouldn't be able to figure out roughly what's going on in Go, right? So you can build strength in a programming language and then go from there. I don't think it has to be one and done.
Definitely agree. And then, like, to maybe even put in perspective how important it is at this point for networking. Like, if you don't have Python on your resume at all, like, we probably weren't even going to interview you. Like, I don't expect you to be an expert, but like, print me a hello world, show me how to understand import a module, and that goes like 90% of the way there, honestly. And so, like, having some programming experience, like, I think is like critical at this point.
And structured data, right? Like, you're gonna have to write a YAML file. Like, you're gonna touch something eventually that's gonna need YAML. You're probably gonna need to be able to parse JSON at some point.
Yep.
It's just inevitable.
Understanding the difference between different data structures and why use one over another.
Cool. So let's jump from there to source of truths. I know we heard a lot about Netbox from a bunch of you guys, and wanted to hear how you guys ended up picking your source of truths. So
We had a good deal on Microsoft Excel, so.
And that's why
best
I
source
started
of
making
truth.
inventory.
I mean, in fact, I think we use Netbox pretty extensively just because like the API is fantastic on it. We do have some complaints around it, and I think some of them are being fixed around like change management around the source of truth. It's difficult currently. If somebody went and changed a bunch of hosts on there, I wouldn't know until after it was changed and couldn't approve or deny that. And I think there's some stuff in the pipeline for that for Netbox. And I think like NarutoBot was doing something on that as well. But having like a good source of truth is like critical to network automation. We actually kind of went a little backwards from a lot of companies in that we took our templates and our standards and push them into Netbox and then use that to generate the configs and push into reality rather than propagating our source of truth from reality, because otherwise you're potentially ingesting bad data. And like instead of being like, oh, well, now we ingested these cables being flipped, I go and I flip cables to make them match what Netbox says. So
I think that the source of truth that you choose, having enough data models for everything that you really need to keep track of beyond just say, there's a lot of IP sources of truth out there. There's a lot of, rack sources of truth out there, but they don't always stand together. They're usually stand alone. And then you have to, correlate them and manage that data all independently in different systems. And it can create, not a very good user experience where people don't do a very good job documenting. And it can also just increase complexity in everything that you're trying to do. So Netbox has a lot of data models and is very extensible. So
it's fast too, right? I've dealt with some other sources of truth, and it's it's maybe a half second for each API request, and you start doing that recursively, and all of a sudden it's 40 seconds, 60 seconds for me to just pull my data out for one host, and now I got 1,000 hosts, and that all of a sudden becomes a very long process. And so Netbox you can less than a couple seconds usually.
Yeah.
Is Netbox open source?
Yes.
Do you guys also use Netbox up here or something else?
I'm a big fan of Netbox. I don't use it in anger, but definitely appreciate what it was doing. And it was interesting to me, coming from Puppet, where we had a source of truth that was just baked into the product. And I used Puppet before I worked there. So for me, having that declarative state source of truth was table stakes. What's interesting, though, is I think you mentioned it down there, is that there are going to be multiple sources of truth for different domains. And so being able to understand how those interrelate is going to be probably a longer term initiative that folks need to take. And then also things like cabs and control boards and things like that, being able to have a rigor around your process and audit and all of these non-sexy things, a source of truth is really key to that as well.
Deciding when to fragment from what everybody else uses or stay with what they use and maybe take some quality of life hits is kind of definitely one of the more difficult parts of choosing a source of truth, I think.
Well, in case of Kubernetes, you can use a Git repository directly with Helm and use Argo CD just to take the data from any change that you are doing in the single source of truth. Then automate that process also, like a CI/CD or something like that. And I like the Git concept because you can keep track of any change on the single source of truth. It's not just for the code, that you can also put your single source of truth right there and start keeping in track of the changes. And again, you're going to have many sources of truth depending on all the use cases that you're trying to deploy. You have many different teams actually doing automation. Then maybe you need to start thinking and use something like a Git repository to keep all data very well organized.
I use a lot of Git for the versioning as well. We have a FullCtl as a custom version database as well for source of truth. Because I agree, the versioning is very important.
Looks like we've got some more questions. So I'll do the virtual one first and then the in-person measure.
Yep. Ryan online asks, besides lurking on netbox.dev Slack, network to code Slack, and GitHub, how do you keep up with new approaches or tools for automations?
I like to do a lot of searching on GitHub, every few weeks for a new project that may be coming out of certain things, whether it's a new Netbox plugin, search for the Netbox tag, on GitHub every few weeks or subscribe to it or whatever. And just, I think that the communities that you mentioned are great for hearing about new tools and, folks doing new things. Beyond that, I'm not sure if anyone else has any.
They kind of like a little bit tongue in cheek, but Reddit tends to be a pretty good source of truth for some of this. Or not source of truth, definitely not truth. Source of information on kind of what some people are talking about and what they're doing on there. Like takes some of it with a heavy grain of salt. You know, like what people say their credentials are isn't necessarily what they always are, and doesn't mean they're always right either. And then maybe like mini self-plug. We have a group in the Bay Area called Corporate Networking Collective that's kind of open everywhere, but we also talk about different tools we're building and what we like to do in there, and kind of see like, okay, it's like you've done this, it didn't work, we do it this way, it does work, and kind of a little bit of like more peer-to-peer type discovery.
I like to follow release notes for like some of the major automation tools and see like what they're releasing on a regular basis and if any of it's actually useful for what I'm trying to do.
I think everything depends on the use case sometimes. You come to these events and you start talking with people, and then depending on the use case, you can decide if you want to move or you just stay on where you are. I started Kubernetes because I saw Kubernetes helping a lot at the edge because I already have that cluster working over there, and then we were having a lot of issues trying to keep the network adjust to any change on the workloads. And then this is why I started to work with that. And then GNMI started also to come up, and then I decided to move from netconf to GNMI because I felt that it was much easier to control, and you then get the telemetry, and then a lot of other features that you didn't have before. Then I would say everything depends on the use case, because if you are happy with NetConf and it's doing everything that you need, you don't need to move. But if you feel that there is an opportunity to get things better, then you need to start asking around to the community. I think it is the best way.
And I'd actually like to challenge the community to seed it more as well, right? Write a blog post about the thing that you tried. Success, failure, write the journey down, right? You wrote a script, you made a tool, push it out to GitHub, maybe let some other folks know about it. Because if we look at the contemporary tools that we talked about earlier, they had huge communities in the sysadmin side, right? Puppet has thousands of modules, Ansible has hundreds of modules, maybe thousands now. That was largely built by the community. They saw a need, they addressed it, and sometimes it was collective, sometimes it was solo. So I would really challenge you to put as much out as you can in writing in whatever format works best for you, because that's how you really build community.
So what I
Agreed.
Let's take the in-person question.
Matt Poundset from DNS.org. I'm curious if any of you have approaches you really like or tools you really like for when you're first, particularly when you're first rolling out automation on network devices, but also for maintenance. Identifying places where current reality and what you're building in automation don't quite match in order to bring those closer together one way or the other. Is there stuff you particularly like for helping with that?
Diff sync is an interesting tool, you know, being able to take differences between device configs or what's in your source of truth and being able to come up with the differences that are in them. And there's several tools that are built around that, depending on what source of truth you use. I know that there's a Netbox and an Autobot plugin to be able to pull the live state of the network and come up with discrepancies from what's in the source of truth and things like that.
Yeah, we're kind of in the middle of shipping a product to do this internally. Where basically it logs into every device once a day. Much easier with like devices that allow you to stage configs, but basically do a stage config, delete the existing one, put a new one in, and is there a diff? And if there is not a diff, like great, this device is in sync. And if there is one, mark it in we have a little graph that just shows what percentage of devices in compliance, and then I can see at the end of the week like how we're looking, and that graph does dip because all of a sudden now I've changed an access list and we have to push it out everywhere. So it'll come down, and as we push it back out everywhere, it goes back up. But I think it's mostly internal build stuff like that right now, but maybe a good product for anybody out here who wants to build one.
Yeah, with the diff as well, the first thing I do on any project is create a tool that does a diff, because it's just the first thing you always need it.
Sam with Vector Data Systems. How our business operates is that we do managed services for a ton of different companies. So we have almost every single vendor out there and tons of different clients. So we can't necessarily SSH into these devices. So how would you recommend getting started into like an automation for a networking perspective?
I think narrow your scope. would be the first thing I would say. Like, what are you specifically trying to automate, and start from there. And if you're trying to automate configurations, like, well, you'll need to be able to connect in whatever way you do configuration. So if they want to allow SSH, maybe you email them once a week. This is what we expect your config to look like. But if you're trying to automate, for example, just like SNMP checks, you could write some script to do that very quickly. But it's a narrow scope, and then expand from there.
And try to be as vendor neutral as you can.
Yeah.
Because that's going to really help if you've got a large scale of vendors to work with.
I think that's good for anyone anywhere.
In general.
Always start with
Even if
vendor
you have
in mind.
one vendor.
Yep.
Like, still try to make it as vendor neutral as you can, so that way, when you do change or add a new vendor into your environment, it's also easier to adapt.
Yeah. Sorry, vendors.
Well, my experience is sometimes you can use a multi-tenancy solution like Kubernetes, but everything depends on the customer. For example, in the case of government, you are forced to split everything and have independent teams. And everything depends on what kind of compliance you're going to have with the customer.
Got one from the online people. This comes from Ryan. Oh no, Justin, pardon me. A lot of conversation around network automation leans towards being dev first, network engineer second. I don't have that option. Is there a path to come from the engineering side that doesn't involve me being a developer?
I started as a network engineer for many years before I started learning how to automate. So I think that's maybe even the better of the two workflows. It's a lot of developers are very good at what they do, but it's a little tough to teach them the OSI model and like the caveats and pitfalls that come with that. So you're actually in a good place to start where you are. I think personally programming is a little easier to pick up of the two.
And I think that we're in a good place now where there's a lot of tools out there that you don't necessarily have to be as proficient in any programming language to be able to use for basic configuration tasks. Ansible is not, it has some concepts of programming, but it's not like you're writing, a whole script or program in Python to do it. They have the modules pre-built and all of the logic pre-built, and you just have to define it.
Well, the answer could be somewhat inflammatory, so I have to think very clearly about how I want to articulate my thoughts. But it was kind of mentioned in a session yesterday, a gentleman, I believe, from Oracle. The career path is changing around us constantly in technology, right? And so you may be able to stay very specialized in a particular domain of networking for the tenure of your career, but at least in enterprise and in software and cloud, things are changing. And in many ways, they are changing with or without this group of people here. If you look at some of the things that happened in like Kubernetes, for example, with networking, it was because they didn't want to wait 2 weeks for somebody else to go do work. They have to have the velocity to deliver software. And so I think you're going to have to be very honest with yourselves about what you want to do and what your time horizon is in this role, right? Are you going to exclusively stay technical? Are you going to go into management at some point in your career? Where do you want your boundaries to be with the other parts of your organizations? And that's going to differ if you're a SP or a data center or an enterprise. But really just being honest with yourselves, because there are still gentlemen and women that are doing COBOL day in and day out. There's still lots of AS400 out there. Some of that was intentional and some of that was not. So I think this is probably an inflection point in this community.
I would say don't be too ambitious. Try to start with small steps. And then you're going to start discovering some quick wins, right? Start with the quick wins. Small tasks that you can start, automating. You don't need to know too much code in order to do that. If you want to do something in a very small step, that is my suggestion, because I'm coming from the opposite side. I have to turn myself into a network engineer to start automating in the network. I was coming from the development.
Do it the hard way.
Yeah. Another question for us, Michael?
Yep. Barry asks, some have mentioned Netbox extensively. What are your thoughts on Natobot as a source of truth?
We just started kind of looking into it a little bit. It's definitely something that's difficult to kind of like switch halfway through. And my understanding is it's relatively similar, so you can kind of move to it. But One of my engineers is looking at it and is excited for a number of ways, but it's kind of a matter of is it worth the lift to change from one to another? But I do like the kind of workflow that they're kind of aspiring to have a little more like checks along the way rather than just trusting that you're supposed to be making the change.
Yeah, I mean, Autobot was, a fork of NetBox, I think v2.10, somewhere around there. So it didn't get a lot of the v3 improvements that NetBox made. And, they both have very active communities. They both are very similar. If you build a plugin for one, it's pretty easy to port it over to the other, depending on what exactly it's doing. They're both Django based. They both have their pros and cons. But it all depends on your org.
No strong opinion.
Yeah, no strong opinion.
But definitely do your homework, because like you're saying, it's going to be a lot harder to lift if you change your mind midway through. And that's for any source of truth, really, right? If you're just going to up and change it, that's a lot of work to move a database over to a completely different structure.
Yeah, an engineer of mine asked to do it, and like my OKRs flashed before my eyes, right?
All right, so since we're having lull in questions again, I was going to come back to asking you guys about some of your use cases that drove you to networking, or some of your favorite examples of things that you've automated that really helped you out in your careers. So we'll just pick a random person. Give me your favorite case of automation that got you into it.
It was probably like the first network automation I did. It was leveraging big multicast financial networks, which was just, to me, it was insane that it wasn't automated. And I inherited this stuff, and I was like, yeah, it's all cookie cutter. And I built some tools that dynamically did all the ranges and pushed out, and the multicast all came up and started working magically. So that's when I started doing network automation.
How long was that?
Huh?
How long ago was that?
2010.
No?
Well, I think one of the first use cases that I did with Kubernetes in the data center was with the load balancer service. Usually you have in the public cloud, the load balancer service is actually the most popular, but when you are doing something on premise, you don't have it. Yeah. And then we have the spine leaf and the board leaf, and then we created through Helm a way to program everything, creating the EVPN in the fabric, and after that, starting to do the BGP between MetalLB, that is open source for load balancer, with every leaf, and exposing all the public IPs directly on the board leaf. That was actually when starting to work was really, really great.
Actually, my first automation love was in the cloud. It was AWS EC2 before they had auto-scaling groups. So many moons ago, and we had written some automation and leveraged some open source tools from Netflix to scale compute based on metrics, which at the time was really, really new to us. I was actually working at Juniper at the time on the cloud side. And so that kind of gave me the bug. And then later at Puppet, being able to work with some of the other vendors on things like the iOS module, the Nexus module, and be able to break that into an agentless world and do some interesting things was a really, really cool experience, and gave me a lot of excitement to be able to open up a lot of doors for other folks to consume that.
I think that my first thing that I remember automating is, I don't know how many of you guys have set up servers, but when you have to do a lot of them and you're doing it by yourself, it gets very tedious very quickly. And so, just starting everything from, pixie booting them and kicking them off with kickstart scripts and things like that was kind of my first bit of automation. And as I started to do more of the network engineering side of things, then it followed. But my favorite things to automate are the simple ones that solve a very big business problem, right? Something as simple as just allocating IP space and putting it on a router. For us, we're an ISP, we do that a lot for business customers and whatnot. And that was something that people did manually and took quite a bit of time, and can be something that you could do so easily with automation that, they're just kind of fun to watch how something so small can be such a big impact to an organization.
Definitely. Yeah. My very first one I remember automating was, I don't think it was the first one I loved by any means. I was just a really simple Perl script that basically is what Jinja does nowadays, but just printed out a config that was really basic. And so I was configuring, switch after switch after switch, kind of as you said, like when you have to do a lot of them, you're like, we're going to figure this out one way or another. I think the first one that I was maybe loved, but also terrifying was I worked for a CDN at the time, and we used Cisco 6500s. And I had to update access lists across all of them, and automating this and hitting this and just going like, oh man, please work. And we tried one at a time, but all of a sudden just waiting to like automate a global outage, and thankfully did not. But it was still a little harrowing the first time doing that. But yeah, and then I think another one that I really enjoyed was a different CDN I worked for. They had about 100 out-of-band devices that were various models of Cisco 1900s, 2800s with like the 16 AS cards in there. And they all had, of course, different size memory and different size flash. And so having this like really long YAML file of like what to do in these different situations for different firmware, and going from what would have been probably a 3 or 4 week upgrade process down to about 2 hours to actually push it out, that was definitely cool to see the actual tangible numbers on that afterwards.
My personal favorite when I first started doing automation was a script that updated port descriptions for like all the compute servers connected, because it was really tedious if they would tell me like the patch plan and then I'd just like type it all out and conf t interface forward, blah, blah, blah. And when I figured out how to write like against APIs and just look at LDP, ARP, IPv6 neighbors and make it happen in seconds, that was like mind blowing, because it was a tedious task I did over and over and over on countless switches all the time. And now it took seconds.
Also, I feel like if you're worried about automating because you maybe won't need to do your job as much, you just don't have to tell your manager you've automated this.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Shall I keep going? Seeing quiet now. All right. What are you guys currently having challenges that you're trying to automate now? What are some of your more recent automation journeys?
One that my team and I are working on right now is essentially rebuilding our entire residential provisioning engine from scratch. So, provisioning ONTs on OLTs, multi-vendor, and really everything that's associated with that, radius accounts, all of that, coming from an old TL1 based system that's been around forever and doesn't work very well, and it's really hard to add additional vendor support too. So that's been interesting for sure, very fun.
Current automation tasks you're working on?
Right now I'm working in the unpopular SRv6. I had a customer that wants to use SRv6, yes. And then what I'm trying to do is simplify layer 3 VPNs going from one place to the other between different edge locations. I'm working right now with a digital sandbox source. And try to simplify with a top level intent the creation of all the services using flexible algorithms in order to bring SLA for different customers on the transport to make it to oversimplify all the the provisioning. And also because we have many cloud native functions working at the edge, sometimes you have too many interfaces on those elements. Using segment routing, you can have only just one interface with a default gateway and let the router to figure out all the routes that you need to take here to different locations. Then this is my project right
now. I touch a lot of different cloud technologies in my current role, and so pretty much everything I do is automated to some degree, either deploying out with Terraform or Kubernetes Helm charts or Amazon CDK and CloudFormation. And so like as a polyglot, I'm pretty much just constantly bouncing around them. So that's not a succinct challenge. It's just trying to keep it all straight at this point, because as you take on more domains, it gets pretty confusing.
I think we're trying to tie in with like basically like a users having a problem type experience, right? And so they go to IT, and IT can type in hopefully just the user's username, and it'll run down, like grab the data off of their laptop, grab the data of that network, do some tests to various sites, or check the tests that are already existing, and hopefully come back with some form of a reason, past just like try rebooting, right? But hopefully we have a little more data to understand it. But some of the challenges there is like now we're getting outside of networking, right? Like what is the best way to do this against Apple? Like, can we do this against the Chromebooks? Can we do this against other things? So we've even branched a little bit out of there, and I think the difficulty is just being outside of kind of my core knowledge base.
Current automation problems working on?
Just trying to do more with interconnection automation and some like peering portals. Like I think a lot of the big companies have them and small companies don't. So trying to bridge that gap or help people bridge that gap anyway.
Any other questions? All right, challenging question. What's something you guys want to automate but have not yet figured out how?
Performance reviews.
There's tools for that now.
Chat GPT is going to start writing mine. I think there's a session on
There
that
is a
later.
session later today.
Maybe they can help me write my self-review.
Only about 80% of the reviews went through ChatGPT at one point this year. So,
Anything you guys can think of that you just haven't quite figured out how yet to actually automate yet?
a true ZTP installation of an enterprise network is something we'd like to do. Like maybe one device touch and like say it's an open gear, and then have it kind of recursively do the rest of it. So I can do just like a single YAML file with like just human readable stuff. I think the real dream would be able to give it to the workplace team and then never touch it all together. But that would be kind of a pie in the sky.
One thing that I've been thinking about quite a bit is we purchased an ILEC, and that's where a lot of our assets came from. So everything that's left, we don't have a lot of good records for, and so many different device types, so many different models, various ages, up to 20, 30 years old, things might have IPs, and trying to figure out a way to really audit all of that in a programmatic fashion and come up with what services, what things are dependent on it, when there is no consistency really on any of the devices.
Another one we're kind of looking at as well is green type initiatives. So like, what does it look like if I turn off half my power supplies in the company right now? Especially if people are like off hours or not, maybe it's not a critical service. And then writing automation to recover should one of those fail while it's only half of them are on, and they now churn that PDU power strip back up. And then how much power are we actually saving? And I think our initial estimates are like the equivalent of 80 houses in Ireland. And so some notable amount of power could be saved from just turning off something that's effectively unused off hours anyways. Or what if I turn off a third of the access points in the off hours as well? And how much power do you save on that? So I think there's some sort of is the business or green initiative worth the amount of engineering effort that goes into this? And I would say yes, but TBD.
Yeah. Any other challenges you guys haven't figured out yet?
Yeah, but maybe it's because I don't have too much experience yet with Grafana. I'm trying to automate the dashboards in some way because I'm having trouble every time that I'm rebuilding my digital sandbox. Make all dashboards to start working and Kubernetes, my virtual Kubernetes in containers, is also changing the IP addresses all the time. And it's a little hard, to keep it all together. But maybe it's because of me. Maybe there is someone here that
I've got something for you. We can talk later.
Okay, perfect.
On that note, I got something for you to comment. I put up our contact information if you guys want to reach out with any additional questions. We're also all on the Network to Code Slack, so we were coordinating the last couple weeks before this panel. So there's lots of ways to get in touch with us if you have other questions around any of the topics we covered today. Anybody else? Any other questions? We got 2 minutes-ish before the next talk. But if not, then thank you guys.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.